Having written a book about anxiety, I've seen a lot of promises about how to solve it. A life hack here, 6 easy steps there. But my own experience with anxiety has been anything but easy. Today, I want to share some of the more unexpected pathways to peace I've discovered in my journey. Welcome to the Unhurried Living Podcast. Did you know that you could join a community of listeners to this podcast who are hungry to grow deeper in the unhurried way of Jesus? There's nothing quite like having a group of like-minded friends with whom to share the journey. We call this group Unhurried Leaders, and in 2024, we are going through my new book, A Non-Anxious Life, in a monthly live Zoom to talk about how to live in the unhurried way of God's peace. We have 4 years of archived monthly recordings that can resource your spiritual journey. I'd love to have you join this growing online community of men and women. It's one of my most encouraging hours every month. To learn more and to join this group, please visit unhurriedliving.com/unhurriedleaders. That's unhurriedliving.com/unhurriedleaders. That's all one word. Welcome to the podcast. If you're new here, I'm so glad you found us. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing so you won't miss an episode. And we'd love if you'd talk about this podcast with your friends and colleagues. Now, as I've been talking more and more about a non-anxious life, a couple of chapters have been initially puzzling to at least a few interviewers. In these chapters, I suggested that the path of deeper peace might well take us in the direction of postures like humility, gentleness, patience, dependence, or even surrender. I'm going to guess that these are not the pathways to a non-anxious life that come first to your mind either. Imagining what these pathways would look like in practical terms might even seem to raise our anxieties. Now, in our search to overcome anxiety and to find peace in our lives, we might look for a way to reduce trouble in our lives. I mean, if we're able to do that, it might just help. But some trouble seems beyond our power to change. Or we may seek to reduce conflict in our life or relationships, and again, if we're able to do that, it can help. But too often, conflict just comes our way, unexpected and uninvited. But what if our most reliable source of peace does not have to do with changing what is happening around us, but changing something that is happening in us? When Jesus says that He is giving us His peace, a peace that's different from what the world is offering, I think this inner transformation is part of what He means. In my book, I highlighted the goodness of what have been called the little virtues. I said that our instinct is often to seek impressive virtues, exciting virtues, even heroic virtues. What if those virtues that are held in highest regard in the kingdom of God are actually humility and gentleness, among others? This is what we hear in the invitation of Jesus, who describes Himself as gentle and humble in heart. Practicing these simple virtues right-sizes my life. Pursuing these little virtues will not lead to a small life. The little virtues are the way of Jesus, and so they are the way of growth in the glory and the power of God's kingdom. Peace grows well in the soil of these simple virtues. That's the end of the quotation. Now, our assumption that everything in our lives must be big and exciting and heroic does not usually add to our peace. In fact, more often, it diminishes our peace. So the first of these little virtues that is a familiar friend of peace is humility. Humility is definitely not a popular North American virtue. Our contemporary culture is far more likely to promote pride as a virtue over humility. Pride is seen as empowering. Humility is seen as devaluing. But the pressure to make a name for ourselves through self-promotion does not play well with peace. The pressure to maintain a certain appearance for others leaves peace in the dust. And the idea that my value is something I have to keep proving or keep earning day after day does not lean in the direction of peace. See, humility is not a devaluing of ourselves. It is releasing the attempt to create self-generated value. Our true value has been given to us. Humility is a receptive and peaceful posture, embracing the value we've already been given. It's a relief, actually, not to think about ourselves as often as we're tempted to do. So when it comes to finding a way of peace in our lives, humility replaces pride, which assumes that getting my way at all times is the path to peace. Isn't it possible that Jesus knows more about the way of peace for me than I do? Now, the second little virtue that plays well with peace is gentleness. Gentleness is another unexpected companion of peace. In one of the few places that Jesus describes himself and his way, he says, "I am gentle and humble in heart." Is that our vision of him? Or is our vision of Jesus a bit more demanding? How do we imagine a Prince of Peace who is other than gentle or humble? Does a Prince of Peace who is rough and mean make any sense? One of the practical ways I've discovered the companionship of gentleness and peace is in how I treat myself. I've had a tendency along the way to be rather harsh with myself in the belief that this would lead to better behavior on my part. I imagined that being hard on myself was the path to goodness. But we're told that God's way to lead us to repentance is the way of kindness. It is gentleness that inspires lasting change. Harshness may provoke a moment or even a season of change, but it also hardens something in me that then remains unchanged. Love transforms our inner posture, and this is what leads to lasting change and, in fact, to inner peace. So, when it comes to discovering a more non-anxious way of living, gentleness replaces ruthlessness, which assumes that treating others as obstacles to my peace to be harshly opposed, that this is the way to peace. It really isn't, though. A third little virtue that guides us to places of peace is patience. One of the older English words for patience is long-suffering. Patience is willing to endure certain forms of suffering or discomfort, especially in the service of others. Impatience is utterly unwilling to wait. Waiting feels like an inevitable place of anxiety. But what or who we are waiting for makes a great deal of difference. My anxiety at times is an impatient companion demanding something to change quicker than it's doing so far. This is understandable. Wanting something unpleasant to change into something more pleasant is natural. But the way of peace moves along the path of patient goodness. A practice I've sometimes recommended to assess the level of hurry in your soul is to purposely drive in the right lane of the freeway. That probably sounds like unnecessary torture. And when I've tried this practice on, my first interior reaction is usually frustration and irritation. I am losing something. I'm wasting time. Maybe. Or maybe the 5 or 10 minutes I'll save weaving through traffic to win my own version of the freeway Grand Prix is actually costing me more than it's giving me. The anger that lies just below the surface as I consider every person on the highway an opponent to be beaten has a way of being corrosive. When I've actually settled into the right lane or stayed in any lane, regardless of being passed by others, I've eventually found that not being in a race is a more peaceful way of driving. If someone else wins that race, it costs me nothing. And the more peaceful me that arrives a bit later at my destination is probably a me I much prefer. Impatience forgets that peace is more gift than paycheck. It is more grace than works. It is more likely received than it is achieved. This is, at least in part, why little virtues like humility, gentleness, and now patience are along the way of peace far more than pride, harshness, and impatience are. So, in our journey toward a more non-anxious life, patience replaces anger, which assumes that demanding peace now from my circumstances and the people around me is the way to peace. A fourth little virtue that helps us find peace is dependence. When I say that dependence is a pathway to peace, I'm not talking about any old variety of dependence. Being dependent on someone who is unreliable or unkind is not going to lead me to peace. Who we are dependent on makes all the difference. There is a sort of holy independence in which we resist the temptation to be defined by others. But there is a kind of unholy independence in which we resist God's way for us. We have a maker, and that maker has a design and a purpose for our lives. The proper and, in fact, peaceful response to that design is something called obedience. Obedience? Doesn't something inside of you cringe at a word like that? I mean, we may think obedience is for pets, or obedience is for children. Obedience isn't for a free adult like me. But we all have someone or something we're obeying. It may be our own cravings, or it may be the advice of someone we admire, but we're following something or someone. Holy obedience is agreeing in mind, heart, and way with the good wisdom of our Maker. Peace comes in alignment with God's purposes in and for our lives. So we find our way into peace as holy dependence replaces self-reliance, which assumes that I must acquire peace by my own self-directed effort. And finally, a fifth little virtue that helps us experience deeper peace is surrender. If humility, gentleness, patience, and dependence are unpopular virtues in our culture, surrender is anathema. We are built as a culture on the virtues of independence and never surrendering. I am not recommending we surrender our lives to every other impulse or priority that crosses our path. I'm not suggesting that sort of surrender helps anyone. Like with dependence, the one to whom we surrender makes all the difference. As in these other little virtues, Jesus is our supreme example. I think of him wrestling in prayer in that olive grove on Gethsemane with what lay before him. His friends join him in a familiar time and place of prayer. This is the evening he will be arrested and will begin to make his way to the cross. Being fully God and fully human, he resists what will be a horrible situation at the hands of the Romans. If there is any way to fulfill all that God has wanted to do for human salvation that doesn't require such suffering, Jesus asks for this. What he prays for is not wrong, and yet he is willing in love to surrender that which he wishes for that which is best. We're living in a time that is very much like the time of the judges in the Old Testament. The last line of the book of Judges says that in those days there was no king in Israel, and that everyone did what was right in his own eyes. There was no sense of common good. There was only a sense of personal good defined as each one saw fit. We're living in a time like that now. And if this sort of self-reliance and willfulness led to reliable peace, why is anxiety at all-time highs? Just the other day, I saw a meme go by on one of my social media feeds. It said, "Feeling overwhelmed? Life out of control? Try giving up." That's the spirit of the connection I'm making here between surrender and peace. When it comes to walking the way of peace, surrender replaces willfulness, which assumes that peace is something I achieve rather than being something I receive. Even as I wrote this monologue, I felt the resistance in me. I heard my own skeptical mind saying, "This is a load of greeting card fluff." But my own experience has taught me that I have found more peace in humility than I found in pride. There has been more peace in gentleness than there ever was in a harsh posture toward myself or others. There has been more peace in patience than there has been in maintaining an edge of anger in my life. There is more peace in receptive dependence than in self-reliant independence. Learning to align ourselves with God's very good way for us through surrender tends to increase peace in our lives and in our work. This, I think, is what the psalm writer means when he says, "Love and faithfulness meet together. Righteousness and peace kiss each other." What have you been feeling as you hear what I'm saying about humility, gentleness, patience, dependence, and surrender being pathways to peace? What resistance arises in you? Is there anything that feels inviting? This could be a very fruitful place to have a conversation with God, the one who invites you into these postures of peace. It's a conversation I continue to have in my own journey. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living Podcast. Join me next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.